When looking at the development of Western art, specifically art as we transition from the medieval into the Renaissance, we have to deal with Arena Chapel and Giotto, and more specifically, a very basic problem of art, which is, when painting, how do you make three-dimensional figures exist in two-dimensional space? Now, much of what you see in the medieval eliminates that. We have gold backgrounds and no real attempt at modeling or three-dimensionality, no attempt to mimic mass. But that's going to change as we move forward, Giotto being one of the first to really make that change. And of course, here at Arena Chapel in Padua, we're going to see him showcase his skills at their finest. To give you some context, he's covering these walls with cycles, in other words, stories. And you would read this very much like a graphic novel or comic book, moving from one side to the other, sort of getting the visual story of what's happening. At the top, we see the lives of the Virgin and her parents, pretty self-explanatory, going into basically why the Virgin was chosen to bear Jesus. The life and ministry of Christ, which focuses primarily on issues of the last 3 years during his active ministry during his life. And finally, the Passion. And the Passion is the series of events that lead up to the crucifixion and the eventual resurrection. So, with that in mind, why are they doing this? They're doing this as a teaching tool. You could imagine a priest pulling out a medieval or Renaissance laser pointer, pointing at one of these during a sermon, using it as an example. In other words, it becomes a teaching tool or a didactic painting. The ceiling originally would have been blue and dotted with gold stars, with medallions of Jesus, Mary, and the prophets. In fact, the ceiling looks very similar to what the Sistine Chapel ceiling looked like before Michelangelo turns up. Now, in all of these cases, obviously looking at the Arena Chapel overall is a lot, so we're going to focus on one piece, in this case, the Lamentation. And what we see are boldly foreshortened angels, so angels that seem to come out of the painting towards us. They seem to dart around in this hysterical grief. It's missing that stoicism that we tend to see in the medieval. And that stoicism is there not because they felt that you need to be stoic in all things, but because they didn't have the ability to create very realistic emotions. Emotions are very tricky to depict in art. Beneath the angels, we see the congregation who is mourning Jesus' death. And amongst these characters, we see Mary holding her son tight, a look of grief on her face, her lip almost quivering, her brow furrowed, the eyes long. She looks like a mother who has lost a child. Mary Magdalene looks at the wounds on the feet and is very solemn. She's throwing back, St. John above her is actually throwing back his arms, as we see here. And the rock in the background is actually a compositional tool. What it's doing is it denotes the image's focal point by its slant. As you come into the image, you look at the rock first because it's the point of the highest contrast, and it's going to point you down eventually to the head of Jesus. These rocks also present the viewer with a constant throughout the cycle, so we're going to see them in numerous images throughout Giotto's work. It also helps because your eye is constantly being cycled through the image. What's happening is you come down the rock and you get to Jesus' face, and then you naturally follow his body, which is a very similar value to the rock, down and around. You come up through the figures who are all looking at Jesus, and you keep cycling in. No matter where you go in the painting, you constantly are brought back to the body of Jesus. It makes it a very powerful composition. There's also a deep sense of grief and loss throughout. Here, Giotto has created a stage for his actors, pulling them from the ethereal, those gold backgrounds that we saw, to the terrestrial by placing them in a fairly realistic setting. Now, obviously, this isn't the world's most realistic image, but It's far more realistic than what we've seen in the past. These figures also have mass and weight, which adds to the realism. What do I mean by that? I mean, as you look at them, they're very three-dimensional. You could almost pick them up out of the image. Compositionally, the work is very strong for the age. The rocks focus our gaze on the grouping at Christ's head. The seated and less active figures to the right contain the scene so that our eyes don't slip off into the next image until we are consciously ready to do so. The borders will do that as well. They keep us in the image until we're consciously aware of moving to the next image. Now, most of the volume and depth that he's creating comes from his use of light and shadow. This use of a single consistent light source was the first step towards the development of chiaroscuro, or the use of lights and darks to create a sense of modeling. The dramatic narrative Giotto developed was perfectly suited to the dramatic narratives the Franciscans emphasized in their primary teaching tool. The Franciscans would have these large wagon trains that would come into town, and they would teach morality plays. They would teach the Passion via drama. And that's going to be particularly important. That's a great way for someone to learn, because not only do you get sight and sound, but you get a sense of connection that you might not get from someone simply standing up and reading a story to you. And we're going to see that here with Giotto. He creates this stage-like setting where we have a set background, which are the rocks and the blue of the sky, a middle ground, which are those figures behind Jesus, and then a foreground, the figures directly around Jesus who are touching him, who are kneeling around him. This idea of a background, middle ground, foreground is very basic theatrical set design, and he's using it to create a realistic image, something that we haven't seen up until this point.